Hi, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. This is the second lesson in a series of lessons in the book of Jude. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the historical and geographical context. The context of Jude is important because in his letter, Jude made many references to events that happened long before his lifetime. And so it's helpful to understand those references and understand what he was referring to in order to fully understand the letter of Jude. Now, before I get into the context, let me review why Jude was written and why it's in the Bible. And we see this in verse 3 and 4. Verse 3, Beloveds, making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, urging you to contend for the faith which has been delivered over once for all to the saints. For certain people crept in secretly, those who were long ago designated into this judgment, ungodly people, turning the grace of our God into sensuality and denying our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. So we see here that Jude wrote to urge people to contend for the faith because certain people had crept in secretly. The problem with these people is they were turning the grace of God into sensuality and they were denying our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. And so Jude wrote to address those two problems. As I said earlier, what I'm going to do in this lesson is look at the historical and geographical context so we understand the events that led up to the writing of the letter of Jude. In the third lesson, I'm going to look at an overview of the letter of Jude, and then starting in the fourth lesson, I'll do a verse-by-verse exposition of Jude. Now let's take a look at the historical and geographical context. Now let's think about a timeline of world history. You have 4000 BC off to the left, that's roughly creation. You have 2000 AD off to the right, that's roughly where you and I are living. Also, if you think about the geographical context of the Bible, the events of the Bible happened in the Middle East, in an area stretching from Iran in the east over to Egypt in the south, Central, and Greece and Rome in the west. When we start reading at the beginning of the Bible, we read about creation. That happened roughly 4000 BC. Then we read about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had a son named Cain. Cain had a brother Abel, and Cain killed Abel because Cain was upset that Yahweh accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he did not accept his own sacrifice. Jude, in his letter, made reference to this, and that comes in Jude 11. And Jude wrote, Woe to them because they went in the way of Cain. The pronoun them referred to the people who had crept into the church secretly, the ones who were distorting grace and who were denying Jesus. And so Jude made reference back to Cain to explain that the people who had crept into the church were doing the same thing that Cain had done. After Cain killed Abel, Adam and Eve had a son named Seth, and then men began to multiply. About 7 generations later, there was a man named Enoch. He lived roughly 3400 BC. Jude also made a reference to Enoch. We find that in Jude 14. But Enoch, seventh from Adam, also prophesied about these, saying, Behold, the Lord came with his holy thousands, to make judgment against everyone and to reprove every soul concerning all their deeds of ungodliness, by which they lived ungodly, and concerning all the harshness which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Here in verse 14, we see Jude made a reference to these. The pronoun these also refers to these men who crept in secretly. And so Jude takes this prophecy from Enoch and applies it to the men of his day who were distorting grace and who were denying Jesus. After Enoch, men continued to multiply. Eventually we read about Noah. Noah lived roughly 2500 BC. During his days, mankind had become so wicked that God brought a flood on the earth and he destroyed all of mankind except for Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. It is at this point in history that we can start to plot things on a map. To the best of our knowledge, the ark probably landed somewhere in modern-day Turkey. After Noah, we read about the Tower of Babel. Men had begun to multiply again. They moved down into the Mesopotamian valley, that broad valley formed by the Tigris and Euphrates River, and there's where we read about the Tower of Babel. God wanted the men to spread out over the earth, but they were staying together, and so God confused their language and he forced them to spread. And we know that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and people divided and spread out based on those family groups. The descendants of Shem headed east and became Asians. The descendants of Ham spread southwest and became Africans. The descendants of Japheth went northwest and became Europeans. Those are the three basic people groups we see in the world today. And the reason the Middle East has always been so volatile is because that's where those three people groups have always met each other. After that, we read about a man named Abram. Abram lived roughly 2000 BC. Abram was born and raised in the lower end of the Mesopotamian valley. God called him to go to the land of Canaan, so Abram traveled up the Mesopotamian valley. Then he stayed in Haran for a while in modern-day Syria, and then eventually he moved to the land of Canaan, which is where God wanted him to go. As Abram traveled, his nephew Lot traveled with him. And very early in Abram's sojourn in Canaan, he and Lot separated. Abram stayed up in the hill country. Lot went down into a well-watered valley, and he settled in the land of Sodom. Sodom was very wicked, and so God destroyed Sodom. Jude also made reference to Sodom. We see that in verse 7. Jude wrote, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, having committed sexual sins in similar manner as these, and having departed after strange flesh, undergoing punishment, are exhibited as an example of eternal fire." One of the things that Jude dealt with in his letter was the people who were taking the grace of God and distorting it and turning it into sensuality. People who thought that the grace of God means that we can get away with sin. Jude made reference to Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of Yahweh punishing sinners. And we'll learn about that more in future lessons. Abram had a son named Isaac. Isaac also lived in Canaan. Isaac had a son named Jacob who lived in Canaan. Jacob had a son named Joseph. Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt. Eventually, the rest of his brothers came down to Egypt also. And then the Israelites lived in Egypt for 400 years. They were turned into slaves. Then we read about Moses. Moses delivered the Israelites out of slavery, and he took them out into the wilderness to Mount Sinai and gave them the Mosaic law. And then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. During that time in the wilderness, we read about two things that Jude also made reference to. In Jude 5, Jude wrote, "Now I want to remind you, you who know all things once for all, that Jesus, having saved people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe." So here we see an example of the grace of Jesus, that he brought the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, but we also see that he subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And so we also see an example of Jesus' justice and righteousness and the consequences for sin. And Jude uses that as an illustration of what he's trying to teach people in his letter. We also read in Jude 11 something else that happened in the wilderness. Jude wrote, "Woe to them, they were destroyed in the rebellion of Korah." Them, again, refers to the people who had crept into the church secretly, who were distorting grace and denying Jesus, and referred to the rebellion of Korah, which had happened out in the wilderness, as an example of what happens to those who are disobedient and are not accurate in their beliefs about God. So the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Eventually Moses led them to the entrance of the Promised Land, and they came to the east side of the Jordan River. While they were there, Balak hired Balaam to come curse the Israelites. Now Balaam could not curse the Israelites because God would not let him, but Balaam did tell Balak how to entice the Israelites into sin. Jude also made reference to that, and that's in verse 11 also. Jude wrote, "Woe to them, they were poured out to the heir of the wage of Balaam." So here, Jude said that the people in his day who had secretly crept into the church, who were distorting grace and denying Jesus, were doing the same mistake that Balaam had made. And we'll learn more about that in a future lesson. Moses died, and then Joshua took over leadership of the Israelites. Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They lived there for several hundred years. Eventually David became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem. And over the next several hundred years, David's descendants ruled as kings in Jerusalem. It's during that time that most of the prophets lived and wrote, the major and minor prophets that we have in the Old Testament. Towards the end of the Old Testament time period, this would be around 586 BC, the Israelites were exiled from the Promised Land over to Babylon because of their sin. One of the exiles was Daniel. Daniel lived in Babylon for a while, and then we read that towards the end of his life, Daniel was taken to Media Persia, which is in modern-day Iran. At the very end of the Old Testament, and this is around 400 or 500 BC, we read about a remnant who was allowed to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. And that brings us to the end of the Old Testament. All the events of the Old Testament happened in the Middle East in an area stretching from Egypt over to Iran. And the major world powers during the Old Testament time period were in that area. The major world powers at that time were Egypt, and then also over in the Mesopotamian Valley, Assyria and Babylon. Between the Old Testament and New Testament, there was a huge political shift westward. Between the Testaments, for a while, Greece was the dominant world power, and then Rome became the dominant world power. And when Jesus was born around 0 AD, Rome was the ruler of the whole Middle East. This geopolitical shift westward is reflected in the New Testament because all of the events in the New Testament happened in the area from Israel over to Greece and over to Rome. So let's take a closer look at these events. In the New Testament, we read about Jesus. He was born roughly 0 AD. Most of his life and ministry took place in Israel. After he went back to heaven, we read the book of Acts, which tells us what the apostles of Jesus did after Jesus went back to heaven. Those are events that happened roughly between 35 AD and 65 AD. During that time period, we read about the apostle Paul. Paul did a lot of traveling and spreading the gospel around the Roman world. We read about Paul taking the gospel message to Turkey, then he took it over to Greece. Eventually, Paul traveled to Rome and preached the gospel in Rome. It was during this time period when the apostles were spreading the gospel around the Roman world that the letter of Jude was written. And let's review again why Jude wrote his letter and why it is in the Bible. We see this in Jude verse 3 and 4. Beloveds, making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, urging you to contend for the faith which has been delivered over once for all to the saints. For certain people crept in secretly, those who were long ago designated into this judgment, ungodly people turning the grace of our God into sensuality and denying our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. And so we see at the time of Jude there was a problem with people who were distorting grace and denying Jesus, and Jude wrote to address those two problems. So that is the historical and geographical context of the book of Jude. What I'm going to do in the next lesson is look at an overview of Jude, and then in the fourth lesson, I'll start a verse-by-verse exposition of the letter of Jude. Once again, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. If you have already joined my email list, thank you, and please forward this to someone else who would benefit from visiting Bible Mountain. If you have not joined my email list yet, please do so now. My email list is free. This is the best way to make sure you receive all my content. In order to join, go to BibleMountain.com, click on email, and that will take you to a web page where you can sign up. Your email address will not be sold nor given away. Once again, thank you for visiting Bible Mountain.